Well, fire away, Pete. I think now we're starting the second session. We hope again to have 4 short presentations. Save your questions, put them in the chat, come online after that. Pete is going to kick off by talking about refugee economies, followed by Patricia, then colleagues Tom Smith, and finally Adrian Healy. So Pete, you have 8 minutes.
Brilliant, thank you. Oh, I've just lost control of the mouse, so I'm hoping this is going to this is still going to work. So here's a little bit of an overview of the research. So the idea is to explore urban refugee economies in Addis Ababa. It was a 2017 study, and the starting point for the study is that, look, most of the focus has been on camps, and it's been on livelihoods and humanitarian assistance. There's been much less attention to the wider economic contributions of refugees, and particularly in cities. And so that's what this study looked at through a series of questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups in Addis. A little bit of context, important context about Addis. It's got one of the largest globally one of the largest refugee populations, an open door policy, but an encampment policy. So refugees primarily enter through camps. There are legal restrictions on the right to work, which basically prevents folk from legally working. And of those refugees who do make it to the city, most are in Addis, and there are around 30,000 refugees there, primarily Somali and Eritrean refugees. And Ethiopia is also particularly interesting because of it being a pilot country following the CCRF and having made 9 pledges, one of those of which was to increase access to employment for refugees. So we're going to do 2 things. One is I'll look at the livelihoods strategies of refugees in the city, and then around the economic contributions and wider refugee economies. So there were 4 main livelihood strategies, the first being humanitarian assistance. The simple conclusion is it was insufficient for people to survive and be well. It was barely enough to cover rent for many. Often in the literature, it talks about refugees having access to remittances, but we found very few of the participants in the study were actually receiving remittances. And again, that's being echoed in some of the follow-up, much larger scale work that we're doing now. So we turn then to the 2 main livelihood strategies in the city, and that's informal entrepreneurship, people running their own businesses or playing a key role in those businesses. But in order to do that, what we're finding is refugees were working under the licenses of nationals, Ethiopian nationals. And those could be quite supportive contexts, or it could be where you perhaps just have a kind of a sleeping partner, and others potentially a bit more of an exploitative arrangement. And those enterprises varied from what we called in our typology, surviving, managing, or thriving, from the kind of person doing their laundry, small amounts on a small number of days, all the way up to folk running car garages, cafes, pool houses. In fact, that photo is of one of the pool houses. But there were also some negative strategies that some of our focus group participants talked about around prostitution and smuggling. And this quote is just one example of one participant who was particularly in the struggling category, but I won't dwell on it. Then we have those in informal employment, so working for somebody else. And that ranged from skilled to unskilled work, casual day labour, across the whole gamut. But importantly, a lot of the work that folk were doing wasn't suited to the skills and the past livelihood experiences that those individuals had. And again, this is something we're exploring in much more depth in our follow-on study. And we also began to see heterogeneity in the types of work being undertaken by nationality, an ethnic group, and that often reflected livelihoods that were undertaken prior to leaving and fleeing their home countries, but also around the extent to which those refugees were settled and had communities, kinship communities in Addis. Moving on from the kind of the livelihoods of the individuals and the households, we then look towards, well, what were the economic contributions, the wider economic impacts of refugees in cities? And this just wasn't being questioned. And there are a number of really important findings. So one is business agglomeration. So we see these kind of new dynamic markets emerging, in particular clusters and areas of where lots of refugees are living and working, whether that's, a cluster of perfumes or clothes sales or whatever. We also saw refugees enhancing existing enterprises. So in the enterprises we interviewed, 85% of Ethiopian businesses were selling to refugees, and all refugee businesses were selling to refugees. So we've got this new customer base. But there was a kind of darker side to that, where we saw refugees being exploited as customers, particularly in the rental market, the housing market. There are also new and sometimes international markets being created, whether that's service-oriented, i.e. kind of rental brokers around housing, sales-oriented, the import of perfumes and clothing through Dubai and Somalia and through the porous borders, but also, again, potentially some more problematic imports around cat, the narcotic drug. And then finally, issues are really interesting findings around reciprocal employment. So 10% of Ethiopian enterprises employed refugees of the enterprises we interviewed, and they were in areas where there were large numbers of refugees. But then nearly half of all refugee enterprises employed Ethiopians. So these are enterprises run and employed by refugees, but employing Ethiopian nationals. And those are messages and things, I mean, partly in the context of the legal environment, it's difficult, but those are messages that aren't coming through. And the final point I want to make before ending my brief talk is just to say, look, we deliberately and purposefully went to find businesses. A lot of folk weren't working or were struggling, and that's leading to a major problem around secondary migration that Alison mentioned at the start. And this is just one quote from one female Somali refugee talking about her sons who were willing to make some really precarious, risky journeys of the sort that many of you will have seen in the media because of the environment, the work environment, and the lack of an ability to be well and get by. So I won't dwell on the conclusions other than to say there's a kind of a compounded disadvantage where you have an environment where work isn't legal and where the informal economy isn't supported. And that's what we're finding. Folk are turning to the informal economy, which is often not supported. And there are quick wins to this in terms of policy solutions that are more supportive. So I'll end it there and hopefully pick up questions afterwards. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you, Pete. Perfectly to time. And some really interesting queries and lessons that I have from that. Patricia, let's move on to you. We'll keep our fingers crossed. If your electricity goes down, we'll come back to you later. Don't worry, we won't leave you out.
Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction, Alison. And wait, why this is not the first one, this one. Okay, so I'm here a little bit, I think my presentation is a little bit different because I'm here to introduce you to the Bordering Economies, that it's a project, a research project that is actually ongoing. And we have data collected already, but we don't have the time to analyze the data that we have collected. But more or less is an introduction to this really interesting project. As I would like to see it, is like a kind of spin-off from the protracted displacement on an urban world that Alison was presenting in the first section of the seminar today. I think about it as a spin-off because this emerged during the literature review for this first project. We realized that there's not much written about the involvement of refugees and internally displaced people, but mostly of refugees in informal cross-border trade. And that's why we decided to move on and present this new project. So actually, we know little things. We know just a few things about how refugees are involved in this informal cross-border trade. We know, for instance, that mobility is central to the livelihoods of many refugees, both inside of camps and out of camps, also for those that are living in towns and cities. Mobility in terms like being able to enter and leave the camp and come in or bring in some new goods to trade, or also the ability of many people to actually cross border into their countries of origin to buy stuff or sell stuff that they have acquired inside of their host country. Then we also know that refugees, many of them actually settle in bordering areas where there's this intense commercial flow, both formal and informal, that takes place, and it's a mixture of both practices that are normally ongoing. The third thing that we know is that that refugees develop actually mobile livelihood strategies, meaning that some families are split between the camp and the cities, for instance, in order to make their ends meet, but also that many of them take several routes and go in and out of the city and into the countries of origin to actually get a livelihood and achieve some sustainability for the future. In doing so, they activate and expand their networks. That's something that it's known, but we don't really know the details, and that's something that we are trying to dig in. And they are actually contributing, as we have seen previously in the example that Pete was explaining to us about Ethiopia, about Addis Ababa. We know that actually they are contributing to the economies, both in the country of origin and in the country that is hosting them. Apart from that, one thing that it's a reality is that the restrictions on mobility and working rights that refugees all over the world endure and have to live with are just limiting their options to be part of the formal trade or to actually get a job with a contract. But we know that these restrictions actually lead to creative ways and strategies and to their engagement in informal cross-border trade commerce. That's what we're trying to deal with. So what we know little about, and these are particularly, I think these are the main aims and the goals of our research in bordering economies. We would like to know the policy and practice implications of the refugee informal cross-border trade for both local governments, both aid organizations and businesses, and also for the security in the areas where this trade takes place, both in countries of origin and host countries. We don't know much about the challenges that refugees are facing when they are involved in this cross-border trade, and the strategies that they devise in order to face the challenge, in order to overcome those challenges. The cost associated with this cross-border trade, because it's not to think, and most of the times we think that refugees don't pay taxes just by smuggling their goods into the country of origin or the country of origin or their host country. They are not paying the taxes in the border, but actually there are many other, apart from paying taxes that we know they do, there are many other costs associated with taking additional or alternative routes to enter those products into the countries. Finally, we want to learn about the reasons why they actually decide to participate in this informal cross-border trade. Apart from that, we don't know much about, we know these trade networks exist, but we don't know how these are formed and activated. And we know even less about how they actually manage to expand these networks in both countries. And finally, we want to learn more about how refugees trade finally in all works and fits local economic development in both sides of the border. So the Bordering Economies project is a GCRF funded. It runs from February until October this year. So it's a really small one and a pilot. And hopefully the research and our findings will lead to something bigger, but that's something we don't know. We are working together with really fantastic partners in Bangladesh, Colombia, and Uganda. I will explain a little bit about the 3 case studies that we are working with them. So the Center for Peace and Justice in Bangladesh, Dr. Neida Albornoz in Colombia from the Universidad Simón Bolívar, and then finally Dr. Kalyango Ronald Siva in Makerere University in Uganda. So we are using qualitative methods, a refugee questionnaire, and we're using Kobo Toolbox, that it's a tool that it's normally used in the humanitarian field to collect information in hard to reach areas where you have no connection or the connections are not reliable, and key informant interviews. And about the 3 case studies, I want to point some of the things or some of the reasons why they were selected. So mostly I have maybe something in the chat is emerging. 2 minutes, thank you, Alison. So we have these 3 case studies. One is Bangladesh-Myanmar border. We are taking a look into to Cox's Bazar and the refugee camp, the huge refugee camp that it's in the border with Myanmar. It's actually located really close to the border, and it's hosting more than 700,000 people. There are forcefully displaced Myanmar national. That means that they are not fully recognized as refugees. Bangladesh is not a signatory of the Geneva Convention. So actually they are not entitled as such, even if they are. They don't have a right to work, and their mobility is severely restricted. They cannot actually move outside of the camp. And that means, and that actually led to a really creative way of cross-border trade, where they actually have connection with Bangladeshi people in order to introduce the products from Myanmar in the camp and vice versa. Then we have, I don't know why this is not passing. Sorry, it's not working. How now? So then we have Colombia. We are paying attention to what is happening in the border right now with Venezuela. We are focusing our research in Cúcuta, that it's in the province of North Santander. There's 100,000 people actually from Venezuela in this area, and most of them are not registered as migrants, not either as refugees. The term used for them is Venezuelan displaced abroad. And we know that they have replaced or take over in informal cross-border trade to many Colombians and Venezuelans that were doing this afterwards. But since the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela started, there are many refugees that are actually taking over in what they call the trochas. There are these alternative routes to actually introduce and move goods across the border. And finally, we have two different sites in Uganda. One is Koboko, that it's a city close to the border, both of South Sudan and DR Congo. And the other one is Biribiri, that one of the biggest refugee settlements in the world, with hosting more than 200,000 refugees. And we know that this is really close to the border. People actually, in Uganda, they have this open border refugee policy. People can easily come in and out. They don't have such an issue. And informality is a great part of the economy, both in Uganda and South Sudan. So these are really different contexts, but what we want to learn is actually there are many similarities across them. Actually, all of them, we can show that this practice of informal cross-border trade is all over the world, expanded in 3 different continents at least. And we want to learn about the similarities and the disparities and the different alternatives and the different strategies that the refugees have been able to develop. So I think I'm going to finish here, just saying that we have completed the literature review, and we are working with the data that we already have from Bangladesh and Colombia, pending Uganda due to COVID restrictions. And thank you, Alison. Thank you to everyone for listening.
That's great, Patricia. I'm glad your internet held out for that, but raises some really interesting questions about who's a refugee. So next we're going to go on to Tom Smith. Tom is a colleague, and he's going to talk about informality and construction supply chains, but particularly in community-led housing developments, a very strong community focus again in this presentation.
Hey, hello everybody. I'm going to try and be quick. As we all know, time is of the essence here. So I'm going to talk about informality and construction supply chains, as Alison has said, thinking about informal and formal networks of materials. So by way of introduction, what I want to do in this presentation, and this is not a fully formed paper, I should say, it's some initial thoughts on some field work that we did a little while ago. I want to highlight how the construction industry has been relatively neglected in research on the informal economy and informality. Yet, as one of our respondents from the National Construction Authority in Kenya highlighted, construction is the biggest industry for informal employment. I'm not quite sure this is backed up by evidence, but it highlights that this is, obviously a significant component of the informal economy, but one which perhaps hasn't seen as much work in terms of research. So what I'm interested in drawing on here, and again, these are some initial ideas, is trying to think about the intersection between informality, supply chains, employment, but also materials and resources that go into the construction of housing, and specifically housing for low-income groups. And part of the focus of our research was to think about the contribution of housing and supply chains to employment generation. So the initial focus of the project, I'll describe in just a minute, was how housing construction contributed to both formal and informal employment, with some focus on the immediate supply chain, so the supply chain within the country itself. There's been limited focus on informal supply chains. Lyons and Brown have written a little bit about the links between African cities and China in terms of supply chains of materials, but this paper mainly focused on relatively small portable items like clothing, electronics, things that can be sold on the street primarily. There has been some work on informality and materials and career trajectories, and I'm thinking specifically here about Deborah Bryson and others' work, who have made links between the career trajectories of informal gold miners and how these are developed in relation to exactly how and where gold is extracted, and how bonds of trust and cooperation form around quite dangerous and difficult work of extraction. But I'm also interested in drawing here on resource geographies and thinking about the particular impacts of materials and how these might structure the way in which informal work is done. Although resource geographies tends to be a bit more focused on the kind of broader geopolitical and power relations that link to natural resources, I think there's maybe something to be gained from looking at kind of new materialist work where there's been some thinking around the properties of particular materials. For example, sand, there's been quite a bit of work on sand already, as a critical component of construction and as a resource which is consumed in vast quantities around the world. And think about how these material properties are linked to how informality plays out. And in particular, I've been thinking about some of Julian Brigstock's work, so again, also in our school, thinking about sand in Hong Kong, thinking about the history of where sand comes from, as well as the kind of everyday illegal and kind of opaque properties of sand extraction. So just very briefly, this project was focused on employment generation and affordable housing. We looked at 3 ways in which that employment is generated: directly from construction, indirectly from manufacture and supplied materials, and also for housing beneficiaries. I'm only going to be focusing on the indirect employment in this presentation. We piloted this in 2016 and then later rolled it out in 2018, both in Nairobi in Kenya and Cebu and Davao in the Philippines, based on projects to build low-income housing for groups funded by the UK-based charity REAL. As part of our methods, we looked at indirect employment in construction, surveying manufacturers and suppliers who were identified as linked to or similar to those supplying the housing projects we were focused on. In terms of what construction and the supply chain generates in terms of man hours, so generates in terms of employment, we set out to try and measure this. And one of the main things that we found is that actually indirect employment in the supply chain and in manufacturing that goes into any property construction actually makes up a much bigger proportion of the percentage of man hours generated by each house than has been expected in previous research. So previous estimates have suggested only between 10 and 12% of the man hours generated per house are in the supply chain. We actually found it could be anywhere from 20% in Nairobi to around 30 to 32% in the Philippines. So this suggests that this is significant in its own right. And of this, sand is a very important component of most housing construction. These are just the figures from Nairobi. I'm not going to dwell on this, but if we compare sand to other materials that go into any particular house, like timber, hardcore, natural stonework, and there are many others, I've just highlighted a few here, sand makes up a very high proportion of the man hours per house. So it's important, basically. And in Nairobi, most sand that goes into low-income housing construction, and probably most construction in the city, is harvested primarily illegally from Machakos County, which is a nearby county just outside Nairobi, from river deposits, although some construction contractors claim it comes from elsewhere to avoid illegality. So for the second sort of half of this, what I want to do is think about the way sand is extracted. And again, one of our respondents pretty much summed it up by saying the sand business is not for the faint-hearted, i.e. it's hard work and it's difficult. I want to talk about the informal supply chain of sand. So trucks like this one we can see in the slide, and the truck team that goes with it, maybe 5 or 6 men, leave Nairobi early in the morning to go to the river extraction site in Machakos. They leave very early to avoid the authorities. The extraction relies on local excavators who are based at the site, who are doing informal day labor, who work in teams, often groups of the same tribe. There are around 5 people in each team in the extraction team, and they often employ boy runners who they send to truck teams to tell them where the sand is available that day. And those trucks tend to have a relationship with the excavators as well. So the excavators and the trucks have to keep moving to different sites in terms of where the sand is available on the river, because the river itself moves and migrates through its sandy deposits, but also to avoid the authorities, because what they're doing is illegal. I should say that sand harvesting from Machakos was made illegal, and that's made it into news in the UK as well. On top of all of this, there are cartels who can charge both drivers and excavators to work on their land. And they've developed a semi-formal system of a sticker placed on a truck window, which lasts for 1 month, to avoid kind of repeated harassment at any particular site. So the truck teams, in their journey from Nairobi to the river and then back again, make a number of both formal and informal payments. They pay a county fees across the county border. They budget a small amount to bribe traffic police for every journey, but they also try and avoid weighbridge fines by dumping sand and returning for it later. And there can be teams of loaders based around the road in order to do this. So sand which is transported to Nairobi is not sold necessarily directly to contractors. It often goes through brokers, and there are a number of roadside dumping points where people work to unload and reload sand. So like many forms of employment in construction, driving for sand extraction has a form of apprenticeship. Most drivers are accompanied by someone when they first go to the river, mainly because it can be difficult getting in and out. There's a number of risks associated with truck operators. They can be dismissed for reckless driving, particularly if their truck gets stuck in the sand. Lots of drivers are looking for work, so it's a bit of a precarious market. Trucks are often overloaded, so that's dangerous as well. But a lot of the other jobs, as we talked about, extractors, are quite low skill, and there's a lot of unemployed young people working nearby the city who race to unload trucks to get them to be paid for that. There's some evidence of formality though. So despite the illegality of the work, extractors and truck teams have formal saving schemes, or formal SACCOs in the Nairobi context, where they share savings, and drivers do need to have a formal license. So just in the last minute, I'm going to try and link some of what I've just said to thinking about this idea of the properties of sand. And I suppose one of the things I'm interested in here is the way in which the kind of illegality of sand harvesting and its difficulty of extraction perhaps generates this kind of complex informal supply chain with a number of kind of nodes along it, if you like. So the extractors, cartels, unloaders, etc., all of these attempting to work around the complexity of the supply chain, in itself generating perhaps informal work in various places. But we can also see how the various material properties of sand as a raw material has a certain ease of extraction in a way. It's open and accessible. It requires relatively low skills, but the physical difficulties of extraction, like trucks getting stuck, the heavy weight, the constant moving to different sites of the river changes, makes it quite difficult to handle. So sand is both a kind of amenable and a difficult material. It can easily be dumped, moved, sold on roadsides, but at the same time, it requires heavy machinery, trucks, and a supply of informal labor alongside that.
So Tom, can you bring it to a conclusion?
Yeah, so that's all I'm going to say for now. There's a range of other issues around perhaps the quality of sand that might be of interest too. But as Alison has prompted, I'll bring things to a close. We looked at a range of other materials as well as sand beyond that. All right, thanks very much, everybody.
Fascinating, and I think a very under-researched study. So thank you, Tom. And with that, we're going to move to our final speaker, from looking at what's above the ground to what's under the ground, and look at informality. Adrian, are you there, and are you around? You are. I can see you.
I'm definitely here. I hope I'm around, and I hope everybody can see a set of slides at the moment. So
yeah, that's fine.
Super. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you. Actually, I'm looking forward to this, and I've really enjoyed all of the presentations so far. And I think actually one of the things that I've taken out of the conversation is that dynamic tension almost between the formal and the informal sectors, a little bit like what Tom was just speaking about. And I think what I'm going to talk about now is going to pick out some of that as well. As a way of background, it's about a decade, I think, since the UN explicitly recognized that access to sufficient water for personal and domestic uses is a basic human right. At the same time, I think there's less than a decade now that we've got left to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of ensuring universal access to safely managed drinking water services. What I want to talk about is actually the challenges of meeting those goals. One of the elements that we can see is that the demand for urban water supplies is continually increasing at the moment. Rapid urbanization, growing populations, economic development. It's all putting real pressure on demand for water supplies, particularly those supplied by municipal authorities. But at the same time, there are real challenges to the supply of water itself in many cities. So those challenges are really accentuated by aging water supply infrastructures, unreliable infrastructures, the implications of climatic change as well, which is reducing the amount of water available at particular times of the year in certain cities. And that all puts a real tension around municipal water supplies and the accessibility and availability of water. And so my research is asking questions about, well, how do populations respond in the face of these water stresses and water shocks on them?
Adrian,
yeah.
your sound is coming and going a bit. Can you just kind of make sure you stay close to the microphone?
I'll stay exactly here in that case, Alison, and see how that goes from there. So hopefully that will be better. So what I was saying is that I'm interested in exploring how urban populations respond to water stress, how they secure their resilience to episodic or to endemic water shocks, and how they secure their own water supplies. In essence, looking at the rise of what we often term self-supplied urban water infrastructures. In that, I suppose I'm influenced by some of the recent work by Sturl and others on what they frame popular urbanisms, moving on from the notion of informality itself and thinking about how that informal economy influences that social construction of urban space, something that Hessam, I think, was talking about earlier from there. And by way of example, although most of my research is across different places in sub-Saharan Africa, I'll just draw on some examples from Lagos and from Nigeria for the moment. This is around Lagos. Piped water supplies are just one small part of the urban water mix. And I think we'll all recognize that from different cities that we know and different locations that we know. Depending upon which survey source you want to believe, in Lagos, it's either a fifth or less than a tenth of the population make use of piped water supplies for their drinking water. Packaged water is by far the most popular source of drinking water, but actually water that's drawn from wells or from boreholes is, in some surveys, much more significant than piped water supplies, or in others, around the same level of significance. And if we actually look at the secondary sources where people use a source other than packaged water, then the reliance upon boreholes and well water, that sources from groundwater becomes even more significant from there. That access to boreholes and to groundwater is often being met by the individuals themselves. These are not communal resources, they're private investments in private water resources. Getting data on that's really hard, but some of the research that we've been doing looking at this suggests that perhaps up to a third of the population have access to their own water supplies supplied by themselves on their own premises. And actually in some survey work that we've done, which admittedly in this instance was mainly on or mainly involving middle and higher income households, that rose to almost 2/3 of the population having access to their own private borehole for daily water usage. Across Africa, we can actually see a very similar picture as well. Nigeria and Lagos are not unique within this, but also it's fair to say that they're not entirely representative either. So between 2000 and 2017, the majority of the urban population in Africa saw rising levels of access to improved water supplies. But that was through a mix of sources. In some countries, it was due to increases in the reach of piped water supplies, those municipal supplies from government or utilities. But actually, in a significant number of countries, with the ones where you can see in yellow bars in this diagram, that was because of an increase in the proportion of the population accessing non-piped water supplies, those groundwater sources that I was referring to, or those packaged water, which often also comes from groundwater as well. And so actually what we're beginning to see is a real kind of tension between the use of groundwater sources for municipal water or for urban water supplies and municipal water access. Why is this important though? I mean, at one level, it's just important, surely, that people have access to improved water sources, supplies of water that are safe, which are accessible, which are actually of high quality. Well, in part, yes, but actually there are some other elements to this. The first conclusion, of course, is that these safely managed water supplies are often provided more readily through non-municipal supplies, which is a little bit worrying for those who are pushing municipal water supplies as the solution to water challenges and sustainable development goals. Often these sources are free of contamination, they're available every day, they're accessible on the premises when they're needed. But they're certainly part of an informal network. Often in Lagos, the boreholes are drilled by plumbers. They're not drilled by water professionals. They're unregulated in that respect. They're non-taxed, they're unlicensed. The quality is highly questionable, partly because there's no quality assurance. And that raises questions about the long-term effect that this might have upon the groundwater supply itself, whether there's over-abstraction or whether there may be contamination of the groundwater. But also, this is not just about drinking water. In Cape Town, we saw a significant increase in the proportion of well points, another phrase for boreholes, being drilled during the 2018 drought. This was for many residents who wish to access water supplies, not for drinking, but for watering the garden, for filling the swimming pool, for their domestic uses. This was water supplies being adopted on an informal basis by the well-off, the very high-level income groups. And I think that's one of the key aspects to this, that informality in urban water supplies in these examples is equally a middle class and wealthy phenomena as it is a phenomena of the urban poor. And one of the elements that comes through this is, as I said at the beginning, that dynamic tension that we can see between the informal sector and the regulated formal sector. There's a toing and froing that goes on as governments are less or more able to supply water. As Alison was identifying earlier, residents come up with their own solutions at that stage and fill the gaps within this. And that shapes the development of the urban form. And also, it often provides resilience in the face of to inhabitants and residents in the face of day-to-day water stress. The question, though, that comes out of all of this is whether these are resilient urban forms over the long term and whether vulnerability is being transferred to other groups or over time and into the future. And I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks, Alison.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adrian. There's some big questions raised across our four speakers by the challenges of informality for small scale and niche populations and communities, but also what happens when the whole of basic infrastructure services start to become informal, such as the materials supply for the construction industry and the urban water supply. So we've got one question already from Nora. We now have nearly 20 minutes for questions, although I had timed it so that perhaps we can finish 10 minutes early. We'll see how we're going. We already have a question for Nora. We're a relatively small group, so if anybody wants to put on their microphone and video and actually ask questions, you'll be very welcome to join in. But Nora, let's just come to yours. It's a question for Adrian. How does informality in the water sector in Lagos collaborate with formal water provision And to some extent, you've talked about this, like informal water providers lobbying to maintain power over water resources and municipal reluctance to provide water infrastructures in informal settlements along the coastline. Nora, it sounds as though maybe you know Lagos. Adrian, do you want to jump in, and then maybe Nora can come back to us?
I'm happy to, and I'd love to engage in a conversation on this as well. One of the key, sorry, my internet is unstable apparently, forgive me. I'll switch my video off a moment. One of the key challenges in Lagos is that it's individual households, many hundreds of thousands of them, that are supplying their own boreholes and having their own boreholes put in. One thing is that the state governor did at one stage try to regulate this, and there's still discussion about this, and there was a political backlash against it. The argument being that if you cannot supply us with water, how can you regulate our water supplies? The fear was that the government was going to tax the boreholes that people had, and that was not popular. What you see less of is you see less water vendors. So you don't have that same water supply informality sector. You have a different informality sector in that it's the plumbers, the professions that drill the boreholes, which are more significant. And what I would say to that is that the professional drillers have established a professional organization trying to protect their businesses. Because the plumbers who do this informally are undercutting them. So you can see some real tensions emerging in who is regulating what and who wants what to be regulated.
Nora, where does your question come from? Do you know Lagos, or have you looked at water elsewhere?
I'm doing my PhD about water and health in Lagos, and specifically I'm looking at an informal settlement which is called Makoko, which is built on water but has no access to water. And the question comes because I've read in a paper by Matthew Gundy, who did a paper on exactly water structures and informality in Lagos, that there is a sort of fight over water predominance by water lords, that's how they were called, with municipal agents. And I was wondering, because I didn't find anything else about it, I was wondering if you had any information or insight.
I don't, because most of my work has not been in those informal communities. And there you're right, there is no access to water. Or very limited access to water, and so there the vendors have a lot more power from there, and there is a very strong political debate around that. Just as an aside, we need to give other people time to come in. There is a real challenge because a lot of those informal settlements are at risk of clearance as well, and so there's a temporality to those structures, and so the political battles are actually quite difficult in those circumstances.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting.
Thank you. Really, really good question. I think there's some interesting issues about how this informal water supply in middle and upper income areas is predominantly individual, but as soon as it moves into low income areas, you start to get kind of gang control or the kind of co-option of that power relations. We've certainly seen that in work that a PhD did, Said Ahmed, in Karachi, where the same sort of mechanisms were working. So we look forward to your findings really closely. Does anyone else want to come in and switch on their microphone and video and join us, or put anything in the chat? I've got a question that I wanted to address to Tom, because I mean, what's really interesting is that with the sand supply, you're looking at supply chains, and here in Nairobi, there's a very local supply chain. So you're avoiding flying sand all over the world in plastic bags, which then pollute the oceans. And I mean, how do you see this challenge between locally supplied material, locally produced material, and environmental sustainability, and the challenges of the lack of regulation. And is that something that you've come across in your literature and reading, as I suspect it won't have come up in your field work?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I think that's a really interesting and important point. From work that's previously been done on sand extraction, a lot of the discussion has been around cross-border extraction of sand and the kind of I can't think of the right word, but the moving, taking away of kind of the environmental issues away from the kind of urban context in which that sand's being used. Sorry, the sort of displacement of those environmental problems to other countries and other nations, and some of the kind of political relations around that. Yeah, but yes, I mean, in some ways, I suppose one of the issues I was trying to highlight in the presentation, but I probably did badly in the rush to get through everything that I tried to cram in, was the tension between, in some ways, thinking about the positives of generating work locally, whether informally or otherwise, and some of the environmental sustainability issues that Adrian's hinted at as well, that could have significant impacts locally. And if there is, such huge demand for sand in the construction industry, it has to come from somewhere, but where, and where is a suitable or sustainable source, and what are the kind of implications of that? I suppose one of the other points I think I was trying to make, and I'm not sure how well this speaks to your question, is that in some respects, what I'm interested in is the way in which the kind of making of sand extraction at a particular point in a particular location on the Machacos River, if that's done in that way, does that in itself kind of almost generate more informal work through all of the kind of needs to physically get around those barriers, positive in terms of generating work for people, but again, what kind of work? So I'm not sure I've answered your question particularly well, but it's something that I'm very interested in, particularly around the issues of sustainability and environmental impact, but also in terms of how the issues around just simply making the extraction illegal at a particular point might in itself be kind of generative of work, which is kind of ambiguous in terms of whether we think of that work as productive or positive or not.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got a couple more questions in the chat. So from Annie Tubaji, and I think probably I'll direct this to both Pete and Patricia. We can see who wants to pick this up. What are the differences and similarities between what's called the grey economy in the developed countries and informal economy in the rest of the world? And how do the two terms reflect power balances between formal and informal types of economies? Which one of you wants to jump in? Pete's got his microphone.
Patricia can start, if you want to. No? Okay, I'll start. There's a simple answer, it's pretense. Because in the global north, you wouldn't want to call it informal, because we've been victimizing those involved in informality for decades. They're the same thing. Even if you look at studies that have been done on grey or hidden economies in the UK, they're describing activities that, I mean, they've got very technical definitions, but you've got to be outside of paying tax is the normal key determinant of being a part of the informal economy or the grey economy. I guess it comes back to Sam's lovely points about necessity versus optional as well. I think one of the starting points for this event, at one point we had other speakers who were doing more on the gig economy and other things in the global north, and it was actually to bring those two into conversation, and I think we'd like to see more of that, wouldn't we? But I don't think, I think if you looked at defining the two, they'd be very similar. If you looked at experiences in the two, I think they'd be very different. I think, from our decades of work with informal economy workers in particular, the experiences of harassment and working despite the law is there is very little in support of those people, and they face all sorts of really harmful actions by local government, by private sector, shops, retail, etc. And I don't think we would document necessarily the same experiences in the grey economy, but it's not an area that I've looked into a lot. I know there are colleagues elsewhere that are looking into that.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. Annie, do you want to tell us what's behind your question? But perhaps we have to think about that as a continuum. Do you want to come online and tell us what's behind your question? Here she is.
Hello. Yes, I had just thought, which was going in line with what Peter just said. I was thinking that it's a question of institutional power, that the formal economy has much more institutional power in the developed countries, and that's why it can actually prosecute much more organized the informal sector. And I'm not quite sure that the grey economy employees are anyhow better off than the ones in the informal sector in the other countries. And the other countries have just a bigger problem in the sense that it's a bigger size. The percentage of the informal economy is much bigger. And then it just normalizes. And I was interested from, related to the question from James, I was interested what's the role of institutions in the whole process, because the informal economy exists because there is need and because the institutions are weak. So maybe this is just a process of making of institutions. And when the institution of the formal economy is stronger, it tries to suppress these guys and to formalize them as villains, while when they're bigger, they're sort of more accepted because the mere magnitude makes them slightly more powerful. But then the balance between these institutional powers is very interesting. I was wondering if there is literature about it, or it's on the making.
I was thinking, I mean, I think perhaps we shouldn't think of them as different sectors or developed and developing, but part of a continuum. And I've often thought it would be really interesting to look at the second-hand clothes trade, for example, and that's, you know, globally networked. It starts sometimes from developed countries, but not entirely. In Somaliland, they have lots of second-hand dresses from Saudi Arabia because they fit local customs.
Yes, and it also has some kind of cultural implications, because if you use two different terms, it's like it's the problem of these other people that are different kind of economy, different kind of development. We don't have the same problems. While it is, as you say, a continuum, it's something global.
Yeah.
I liked also what you said about creativity, that is a way to save yourself out of it. Actually can be celebrated and be completely constructed in a new form.
Yeah, there are a lot of tensions. I think there's a lot of negativity. Where is your research? What are you looking at?
I'm a cultural economist, but what I was thinking is that actually India in the moment is making an attempt to exactly use this informal economy slightly as a tool for supporting their labor economic policy. So I think this is interesting.
Fantastic, really interesting. James, we're going to move on to James, who has a question about academic journals and publications to look at key sources for current research. Hissam, I wondered whether you would, we're mostly on the screen informal services and informal economy, but from this first session, Hissam, do you want to chip in and reply to James?
Sure, that would be fine. Yeah, I guess, of course, it's always dependent on the type of question that you may have, you know, the scope of the work, but perhaps broadly, or the aspects that you're looking or particularly exploring in relation to informal settlements, but broadly, perhaps it would be good to look at the works of Al-Sayed and Ananya Roy, particularly also the Contradictions of Informality by Tonkis. Perhaps that you need to look at the works of Colin McFarlane in this regard, also the works of Kim Dovey and Ross King in relation to informal settlements. Also, if you want a more specific context base, you want to explore the works of Blirenberg and Klumpner, also Ribeiro, Refi, and a range of other authors contributing to the field. I guess I'm gonna stop at this point then.
Give him a chance. He's got to get through that reading first. And I think Adrian, thank you very much. I think Adrian also wanted to come in at this stage.
Just very briefly, Alison, I just wanted to reflect back on what Annie was saying, because I thought it was a really important question as well, because you're right about there being a continuum. But what has struck me in this conversation is that there's already also fluidity as well. There's a coming in and an out. And if we look at Spain during the 2008 economic crisis, we saw a huge increase in the proportion of the population engaged in the informal economy within Spain, because there were no other options at the time. And actually, what we might have is a history of regulatory capture here, as the state tries to regulate over time. It might be the informal economy is the original status from there. The state tries to regulate. We see the same thing in the sharing economy at the moment, as we call it, whereby your point about secondhand clothing, for example, an exchange economy emerges, which the state then tries to regulate from there as well. And I think we just see this across the globe in different phases and different framings along the way. I just thought it was a really interesting way of thinking about things. So thank you.
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, if I may say something also about the Spanish case, and it's related both to the crisis, but also to the situation that we're living right now. So actually, I think that the state is taking advantage of informality. So in the end, they are interested in regulating that. They have the capacity and they have the strength, because previously we were talking about being a weak state or being a strong state. They have the capacity, they are strong enough to actually do it. But they also reap from the benefits of having people working informally. And that means that a lot of people have actually the capacity to join and to get a job, even if they are, for instance, irregular migrants, people that we know that many people in plantations in the south of Spain are working without papers. We know that, but at the same time, having those people working irregularly with no contracts mean that they are not in the streets begging or having other problems. So they are benefiting in the end, and that they might not be so inclined in order to correct that problem, because actually if they don't have access to work that way, they are not going to provide any other venue for migrants to actually legally integrate and be part of the working force. So we have to think also about the capacity of the state and the way they are benefiting about this informality, solving other problems. Yeah, that's all what I want to say.
I also think that brings us on to another point, which I think we probably haven't got time to discuss, but the terminology is important. It came out of Patricia's presentation that the forcibly displaced people from Myanmar or the Venezuelan migrants are really refugees. And also Pete's presentation as well, as who is a refugee? Are they just the ones that are registered? But we've got a couple of other points in the chat. Noura is suggesting that we look at the global Encyclopedia of Informality, and Pete suggesting, Pete, I don't know whether you want to just close on that point in your response to Noura.
Just agreeing with Noura's point about informality existing within formal institutions. And it is building on the earlier point that was made around global north, global south. But to take that further, informality exists and is defined by the formal institutions. And Lena's case study in Cali, if we'd had time to dig deeper, is a really interesting example of where the state then redefines. So offering social protection to those in the informal economy is a really interesting step of, along this spectrum of what is formal, what's informal. It's defined by state. So I totally agree with Noura's point.
It's past the witching hour of 2 o'clock, and I think we will all turn into pumpkins or witches or something, and certainly probably all need a cup of coffee. I just wanted to thank everyone, all our speakers and listeners. It's been a really fabulous session. You've asked us some really difficult and posing questions. You'll find us all mostly on the Cardiff website, apart from Jim Lee, who's moved on, and Lena, who hasn't quite got here yet because of COVID, but is still very much part of the family. So she's working at Isesi University and Jim Lee at Gajah Mada University. And fantastic. Thank you everyone for your contributions. And we hope to see you again next year when we'll have some more new and interesting research to present.